everybody, to the Classical Liberal Seminar. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Glenn Loury, who is the Merton Stoll Professor of Economics at Brown University and also a Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He has taught previously at Boston, Harvard, and Western University and University of Michigan. He's published many books and scientific articles in top economic journals. He also wrote a pioneering article on self-censorship and political correctness in 1994. His most recent book has been widely acclaimed and is titled Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. Beyond that, Glenn is a public intellectual. He's the host of a popular podcast called The Glenn Show, where he discusses topics related to race, economics, culture, and politics. Today, he's here to talk about liberalism and racial inequality. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you, Ivan. Welcome to everybody. I apologize that my camera is not functioning for me, so you cannot see me as I can see you, and that's an interesting experience. But nevertheless, so I have a memoir, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, which was just published, and I'm going to talk about that. The theme of persisting racial inequality, and does that pose a challenge to liberalism? That theme is lurking in the background, but this will basically be a personal reflection. It's a memoir. I want to talk about my dissertation. I want to talk about my break with the right in the 90s. And I want to talk about my reversion to a more conservative posture on some of the questions about race and inequality in the United States in recent years. So I'm going to share these excerpts with you and then open things for questions. I'm not going to take questions along the way. I want to share these words of the memoir that I have just published with you, with your forbearance. So this is from chapter 8 of my book. It's where I describe my doctoral dissertation. Back at MIT, by the spring of 1976, my dissertation is nearing completion. It's a collection of essays that apply the mathematical analysis of random dynamic systems to problems of inequality. I first got an inkling of the idea that one might fruitfully use stochastic process techniques to study inequality when I was an undergraduate. These thoughts had led me to write to David Blackwell with my half-formed ideas. Now the years of thinking are paying off. My dissertation committee agree it's a great success, and I'll work to crafting these essays into articles suitable for publication over the course of the coming years. My dissertation, Essays in the Theory of the Distribution of Income, consist of 2 separate studies. At the end of the first, which I called A Dynamic Theory of Racial Income Differences, when summarizing the implication of my ideas, I coined the phrase social capital. It describes one of the effects I'm trying to capture. My goal is to elaborate a simple model of income dynamics that takes account of social externalities in the acquisition of human capital. These spillovers occur because individuals are connected to one another via bonds of social and psychological affiliation. One result of this is that it's easier for people to acquire productive traits when they are socially linked with others who have been successful. I theorize that such a communal networks of connectivity would, in a society like ours, reflect race identity dynamics. Now, when economists talk about human capital, they're referring to the productivity enhancing traits individuals acquire through education, training, work experience, and some other route. These skills boost one's earnings potential, and the analyst can use them to explain differences in earnings among individuals. One simply measures the human capital, correlates that to the individual's earnings, and in this way accounts for any disparity. My social capital notion extends this idea by imagining that the skill levels of those to whom a person is connected partly determines the level of skill that person ends up acquiring himself. My idea is that human development is not just transactional. It's not just people buying stuff out in the marketplace. It's also relational. It's people interacting with one another inside of social networks. The role played by the family in the process of human development is the clearest illustration of this point. The maturation of the infant from before birth is nested within the web of relations that is the family. You can't come in and out of that web based on changing budgets and prices. It's woven out of human intimate connection among people and reflects their own self-understandings, affiliations, and identifications. Such considerations are particularly relevant, I think, to the study of persisting racial inequality because race is entangled with notions of identity and social meaning. It carries significations and connotations. It conveys implicit understandings. Those meanings are reflected in how people connect, how they associate with one another, how they bond, how they marry. The social construct of race does not even come about unless people behave in a way that reproduces race. Through bearing children, that is, people are deciding to produce and reproduce the underlying physical differentiation that is the basis for race. So I'm proposing a theory where skills, how well you do on a test, how much knowledge and experience you have, determine wages. I go on to theorize that patterns of racial inequality will emerge that have this social capital aspect to them whenever the processes through which skills are acquired are influenced by social relationships and not just accounted for by economic transactions, especially when those relationships are rooted in racial identity. My hope is that this model could help us understand how inequality between racial communities takes root and persists across generations. If we learn enough about that, we might be able to figure out how to alleviate inequality's most devastating effects. Concerning public policy, I argue that attending only to market-mediated transactions via racial anti-discrimination law, for example, and not to informal social relations via racial integration strategies, for instance, would mean failing to achieve racial equality, even in the very long run. This is an important insight in 1976, but the sheer challenge of formulating the models is equally attractive to me. My analysis is highly technical, and that's important to me. I develop an elaborate structure of definitions, theorems, and mathematical proofs. I take pride in that. While I want to make a valuable contribution to society and to Black Americans who suffer under unequal conditions, I also want to contribute to my field. I want to make a name for myself as an economic theorist, one that will be cited by generations of scholars working on these tenacious problems. I want to be known as a Black economist, someone who works to liberate his people. But above all, I want to be like David Blackwell, someone whose brilliance inspires awe. By the time I finished my dissertation, I come to believe that I found a way to do all of these things. So that's the first excerpt from my memoir that I wanted to share with you. And I really appreciate your patience in listening to me on this. I want to go on now and share another excerpt from chapter 20 of the book, where I discuss how I separated in the 1990s from political fellowship with a lot of right-wing social critics on the race questions. As the 1990s progressed, something changed, or perhaps I had changed. A decade plus into my life as a public intellectual, despite my rather scandalous fall from grace in the 1980s, I was still championing the same causes I always had, leveling the same critiques of the present day civil rights establishment that I always had. And why not? The problems of the Black inner cities were as bad or worse than they had ever been. The self-satisfied bureaucrats and hustlers and politicians who arrogated to themselves the right to speak on behalf of Black folks, they were just as full of it as they had ever been. But whereas once my moral critique of race politics and policy had placed me center stage in the public debates, I began to notice that more and more I was becoming a bit player, one who was trotted out when a little authenticity was needed to fill out a panel or argue against some policy or another. What I opposed was clear enough, but what was I for? Still, I may well have continued living happily as a religious neocon firebrand had it not been for the publication of 3 books: Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein's The Bell Curve, Dinesh D'Souza's The End of Racism, and Abigail and Stephen Thornstrom's America in Black and White. These books and the circumstances surrounding their publication exacerbated whatever lingering tensions I felt between my Blackness and my conservative politics, and quickly, within a matter of a few years, made those tensions untenable. The Bell Curve was published in 1994 with the support of the market-oriented conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, where Charles Murray was a fellow. Even before its official release, it became one of the most controversial works of social science ever published in the United States, and 3 decades later, it remains so. The book made claims about the crucial importance of cognitive ability in determining life outcomes and the extent to which genetic inheritance causes observed differences in performance on IQ tests. It weights these genetic factors very heavily, suggesting that attempts to bring various lagging groups in the US up to speed have failed because those groups are intrinsically incapable of performing at the highest level due to their low average levels of intelligence. According to Murray and Herrnstein, African Americans constituted one of the lowest performing groups. This implies that the epidemic of Black underperformance we were then experiencing may be a permanent and ineradicable feature of the American social landscape. It wouldn't matter what kind of program and what form of affirmative action you implemented. It was the fate of Black Americans, due to a low average level of cognitive ability, to remain at the bottom of the heap. Murray had a background in political science, not cognitive psychology. To make the Bell Curve's case about genetics and IQ, Murray relied on Herrnstein, an elite, if controversial, quantitatively oriented psychologist at Harvard. Herrnstein died just before the book's publication. When the time came for Murray to back his claims in public, he no longer had the man who built much of the scientific case for their argument at his side. Nevertheless, AEI knew that they had an epical book on their hands, and they went about promoting it assiduously. They celebrated its release with a conference in Washington, D.C. They must have poured $100,000 into this event. I attended in my capacity as a member of AEI's Academic Advisory Board. Scores of others came, and experts were flown in from around the country to talk about the book. Presumably, those experts had had a chance to read The Bell Curve, and presumably they were already more or less sympathetic to its point of view. Whatever the case, the book received very little pushback at that conference. Once The Bell Curve made its way out to the public, the mood was quite different. Controversy over the book's claims about race and IQ erupted, and it quickly became a monumental bestseller. In magazines and newspapers, on TV and radio, Murray was pilloried as a racist and a eugenicist by anyone even vaguely left of center, and by more than a few who were right of center. But largely, the mood on the right was one of triumph. As the months rolled on and the economists and psychometricians and sociologists began analyzing Murray and Herrnstein's data and evaluating the statistical techniques they had used to reach their conclusions, criticism started piling up in just about every technical journal you could name. Experts took issue not only with the book's policy recommendation and its implications, but also with its methods. Many of these critiques, which were real and substantial, came from top researchers who found the empirical analysis lacking. But rather than respond to the substance of these critiques, Murray blew them off, writing in commentary that the tenured liberals in academia had to reject his findings. If they didn't, their entire world would collapse. This did not strike me as an adequate response at all. My wife, Linda, an economist herself, and several other social scientists wrote replies to Murray's commentary piece, taking him to task both for what they saw as the book's flawed methodology and his non-response to the steadily accumulating body of critical scholarship. I had plenty to say as well. Murray had written a book that, if its argument held water, would reconfigure the way we think about racial inequality in America. He was making extraordinary claims, and so I felt that he ought to go to extraordinary lengths to defend them. I had relationships with Commentary Magazine's editors, Norman Podhoretz and Neil Kazadoy. I'd published a few essays and reviews with them, so I figured they would be receptive to a nuanced essay from me that was fair but critical of Murray. I didn't think he was a racist. In fact, we were friendly. Years earlier, I had spent the night at his apartment in DC when I was in town and needed a place to stay. I sat up playing chess with Murray and his journalist friend, Charles Krauthammer, that evening, and I beat them both, for the record. I admired Murray's earlier book, Losing Ground, a prescient critique of welfare policy, but this IQ stuff was a different kettle of fish entirely. To my surprise, Neil wrote back saying that Commentary wasn't interested in jumping on the anti-bell curve bandwagon. It was clear that they thought of Charles as one of their guys and that they were closing ranks to defend him. I responded to Neil, writing that they were more than happy to have me contribute when they spent months attacking Jesse Jackson for making alleged anti-Semitic comment. If they came for the Jews, I wrote, you'd expect me to step up and say something. Well, as I saw it then, Murray was in effect coming for the Blacks. And Commentary had no interest in anything I had to say about it. What was that about? I never received a response from Neil Kazadoy. After being rejected by Commentary, I went to AEI President Christopher Demuth and requested that the organization fund a follow-up conference on the bell curve. Now that the experts had had a chance to examine the data, a real public debate about the viability of its arguments was in order. If my colleagues in the social sciences couldn't coax real responses out of Murray, maybe AEI could, but Demuth refused. He said that Murray was tired of talking about the bell curve. Murray wanted to move on. There would be no further discussion about it at AEI. I was outraged by this response. I had a lot of respect for Charles Murray. I like Charles Murray. But critics were saying his analysis of the data was fatally flawed. He therefore had a responsibility to answer the charges because the consequences of such an argument as his could have an incalculable impact upon our society. And now he was saying he wouldn't face the critics best equipped to challenge him because he didn't feel like it. The meaning of this was clear to me. AEI was doing exactly what Murray had accused his critics of doing, playing a political game rather than searching out the truth. Maybe I was naive to think that they would host an event that could undermine the credibility of a book that they had poured serious money into promoting. But if Murray and AEI wanted to make claims as consequential as these, they ought to be willing to defend them. My academic colleagues deserved better, I thought. African Americans deserved better. The animus I felt toward the bell curve didn't end there. In the rotating column I was writing in those years for the New Republic, Hard Questions, I would for years take potshots at that book and at Murray. I mocked what I took to be his lack of technical facility. It was all a bit snooty on my part. But the entire incident stuck in my craw in a way that couldn't be reduced to the arguments, and certainly not to Charles Murray as a person. True, I didn't like that he had ducked the critiques. But the reaction I received from conservative outlets when I registered reservations about the bell curve bothered me even more. It forced me to question what I was doing and where I was going in my post-recovery political life. The questions nagged at me. They wouldn't go away. Whatever my feelings in 1994, decades have now passed since the publication of The Bell Curve. If time has not borne out all of its claims, and I think the jury is still out on some of them, what is now apparent is that many of the criticisms Murray received then and is still receiving to this day are wrong-headed and unfair. I was not at fault to insist that he face the critics more squarely, but in my tacit assent to the idea that his or any other investigation into connections between genetics, intelligence, and race is a priori racist, I was just plain wrong. These are legitimate questions, and we're only beginning to grapple with them. Murray's book, whatever its flaws, will one day be viewed as an early entry into an important body of research. Since The Bell Curve, Murray has published many more books, several of which are profoundly incisive works that ask questions few are willing to contemplate out loud. We need more such iconoclastic provocations. We should not simply brush them aside, nor should we write off their authors. Okay, that's the end of my two excerpts from my book. And now I want to share finally, and again, I thank you for your patience, an excerpt from the preface to the 2022 edition of my book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality. That book was first published in 2002. It was 3 lectures I gave as the Du Bois lectures at Harvard in 2000, and it consists of essays reflecting on the problem of persistent racial inequality. And it was reissued in a paperback edition in 2022, and I wrote a preface for that. And I want to share this because it reflects my kind of move back away from the back into the conservative sphere a little bit more on some of these questions, especially on affirmative action and reparations. And I want to get that. I want to get that on the table. Again, I really appreciate the patience that you have shown with me so far. So here is this third and final excerpt. We'll open for discussion after that. In my third Du Bois lecture, I offered a critique of colorblindness and endorsed the practice of affirmative action. I argued that colorblindness as a philosophical approach to public policy was inadequate. It alone could not accommodate the task of redressing racial injustice. This is a view that I would still affirm today. I took some pains, however, to explicitly distance myself from many of the vociferous critics of racial preferences in the 1990s, including Justice Clarence Thomas, the writers Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom, and critics like Ward Connerly and Shelby Steele. In doing so, I reversed the position against affirmative action for which I had been known earlier in my career. This, I have since come to believe, was a serious error. Chalk it up, if you like, to my zeal 20 years ago to mend the breach with my academic co-racialists. In any case, I find myself these days in a sustained argument with the zeitgeist about the nature of the country in relation to the unresolved issue of racial inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. I think the discourse has gone badly off the rails, especially on issues like affirmative action and reparations for descendants of slaves. In previewing the now dated argument of my 20-year-old book, I would like to briefly explain why. Okay, so I say to you now, just stepping aside from the preface for a moment, I am explaining to my audience why my contemporary position, which is a critical position on the issues of affirmative action, reparations, and such, is different from the position that I was taking in 2000 when I gave those lectures at Harvard. And I'm saying that, in part, I was trying to mend fences with my Black academic colleagues and with my Black community cohorts because I was a bad boy conservative, and they had ostracized me, and I wanted back in. And I think that that was part of what was governing my thinking back then. But that now I have come to my senses, you see, and now I see that these are very problematic ways of thinking about the racial inequality problem in America. That was an aside. I return now to the preface, explaining why my views have reverted to the right. Broadly speaking, there are two conflicting narratives about race and inequality which compete for our attention: the bias narrative and the development narrative. This book proceeded primarily by embracing the first, but I have since come to believe that it's the second which is the more relevant for our time. One frames the racial justice issue. How one frames the racial justice issue depends on which account one emphasizes. The bias narrative stresses how white supremacy has done Black folks wrong, about how America has its knee on our necks, so to speak. Present-day anti-Black racism and a litany of historical injustices are the focus. The death of an unarmed Black man at the hands of police can become the 20th century extension of a lynching in Mississippi circa 1955. By contrast, the development narrative puts in center place the incomplete project of empowering African Americans who have been adversely impacted by history to acquire those capacities of functioning and performance that can allow for effective competition on what is basically a level playing field. The first order imperative on this account is to abet the acquisition of the skills and the acculturation of the behaviors that afford youngsters a greater chance for success in life. Now, these are radically different ways of looking at the underrepresentation of African Americans, the bias narrative versus the development narrative, especially in the most remunerative lines of work and in the most selective venues of higher education. Of course, these narratives need not be mutually exclusive, but I have come to believe that it matters greatly for our politics which account one chooses to emphasize. My current view is that the development narrative is by far the more crucial concern. I set this argument within historical context. African Americans emerging from slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and widespread discrimination have, as a group, been diminished in terms of the development of our competitive and productive capacities. This as a general historical matter. Generations of unequal schools, of employment and housing discrimination have impeded the realization within the African American population of our latent potential. Given such a history, one can expect that on day one, there would have been equality. One should not expect, I should say, that on day one, there would have been equality of the various indicia of achievement, since the background conditions did not afford us an equal opportunity to realize our full human possibilities. This is the status quo ante from which affirmative action emerged a half-century ago, the baseline from which we have endeavored to move forward towards something more equal. In the face of this historical inheritance, some policies of racial preference could, I think, be justified. But time does not stand still, and we now face a difficult historical challenge. We are at a crossroads and need to reevaluate. In keeping with my argument from 20 years ago, I do not here object to affirmative action as a matter of principle, seeing it as inherently unjust racial discrimination in reverse. It was both necessary and proper to rely upon some preferential treatment for descendants of the slaves as a temporary stopgap mechanism, I'd say. But the fundamental developmental deficits that history has bequeathed to us must also be addressed if African Americans are to compete effectively going forward. And effective competition is the only path to genuine racial equality. We are not facing up to this challenge. Instead, we have settled for a second best remedy, less exacting criteria for selecting African Americans. This is a form of cheap grace for elite gatekeepers to use preferences as a cover for the consequences of our racially unjust history. Ultimately, Black people are going to be the ones left with the short end of this deal because relying on racial preferences in elite venues invites patronization, condescension, contempt, dishonesty, shame, and a general erosion of standards, precisely in the places where the competition for status is most keen. This may yield racially proportionate representation, but it is a long way from achieving genuine racial equality. As for slavery reparations, this policy may seem a logical extension of the foregoing argument, but stipulating that history casts a long shadow, I nevertheless think this is the wrong way to frame the problem. It is natural to try to monetize the racial depredations of history, but I nevertheless think that this is a mistake for Black people ourselves and for the country as a whole. As a practical matter, no sum of money would be large enough to indemnify those suffering the ill effects of our unlovely racial past from the consequences in their lives and the lives of their children of what history has wrought for them. However, enactment of monetary transfers based on racial identity in the name of reparation would in effect commodify the claim that African Americans have on the general public's attention to the problems besetting our communities. It would constitute a transaction on the basis of which we will have been paid in compensation for what history has wrought. It would be unwise, I think, to discharge that moral obligation in this way. I would advocate for interventions aimed at reducing the most deleterious effects of our racist past, but I would object to sitting at a bargaining table with the rest of America, us with our moral capital on one side and the country with its financial capital on the other, pushing that moral capital into the middle of the table and receiving money in exchange. The ability for us to command the larger society's attention to the certain to be ongoing social maladies afflicting so much of Black America will have been significantly diminished. Far better, in my view, more ethical and also more politically effective would be to take what moral capital we might have, combine it with the influence of others on behalf of creating a decent social contract for all Americans, and then working hard to get that implemented. If that program were to succeed, then bad schools in African-American neighborhoods would get attention, jails overflowing with Black people would become a big social issue, and the needs of families, employment issues, healthcare concerns, and so forth would be attended to. They would be attended to for all Americans, and therefore for those African Americans most in need. Do not try to cut a separate deal with America, is my message to Black people. That is a mistake. And that, my friends, ends my reading from the Bible. Reading from the works of Glenn Loury. I'm very happy to have contributed, and I'm open for colloquy.
Thank you. Yes, we have a lot of questions here. So the first is Rick Schroeder.
Hello, Glenn. Thank you very much for that presentation, which was certainly riveting. I guess I have two things that came to mind. One, the Amish, and two, Carl Degler's book about the history of thinking about environment and inherited characteristics. Why did I think of the Amish? Well, your model, as you described it, as developed in your thesis originally, about externalities and social capital, strikes me as basically a general model about everything that one acquires by virtue of being a member of a group or a cultural group. And I think about the Amish because if you look at the Amish, they, as a people, clearly disvalue white-collar jobs. They don't want their children to become ballet dancers or bankers or lawyers. They value manual labor. And the Amish tend to live in some of the poorest counties in the United States. So if one were actually trying to achieve equality, it strikes me that the price you'd pay is essentially the elimination of cultural differences. And I'm wondering how you think about that issue. I mean, people speak the language they speak by virtue of the group they're in, the religion that they practice, their attitudes towards gender differences, their attitude towards work. So I'm wondering how you put that together. I mean, the press for equality, it strikes me, is essentially creating a homogeneous cultural group and really works against a plural society where there are, or semi-autonomous at least, traditions and heritages, which of course are going to have different kinds of skills that they value with attendant consequences. The other question I had with regard to Degler's book is that it doesn't, the Murray book is not extraordinary. If you go back historically to the late 19th, early 20th century, at least according to Degler, to a period prior to Roosevelt and a whole set of political processes going on during the 1930s and 40s, people talked the way Murray and Herrnstein talked all the time. And it raises the question about whether, in fact, there isn't big political ideological stuff behind any of these discussions. And I'm wondering how sanguine you are about there really being a possibility to be a positivist empiricist and put all those things together, even today, in having that discussion.
Wow, well, thanks, Rick. The Amish. I mean, it makes me think a couple of things. I take the point that the evaluation of outcomes is culturally dependent. I mean, what is equality? I mean, it's a very fundamental.
Right. I guess that's my question: how you differentiate inequality from difference.
And I don't. I mean, I think we're using some standard metrics of social outcomes and the incidence of certain, kind of maladies and so on. I mean, health, income, wealth, occupational, representation in different venues, and so on. But I'm aggregating across people in racial category, and then I'm imputing some significance to the difference between those aggregates across the racial categories. And that's already a kind of a move. And so I'm viewing, I mean, there's a kind of teleological dimension I'm bringing to the interpretation of history here. I mean, I'm saying African Americans are enslaved. I'm saying they're subject to second-class status. I'm saying there's a civil rights revolution. I'm saying there's a kind of problem on the table for American society about the disparity. The disparity is significant in political terms between these aggregates, which are also in some ways arbitrary. So I put it in that context, but I take the point that the expectation.
I mean, do you really want equal opportunity, I guess is what I'm asking. Because it seems to me equal opportunity, if you took it literally, is the end of cultural differences. Because if there are cultural differences, there's not going to be equal opportunity. There are going to be some places that value this, teach their kids this, give them access to this, and others who have other things that they value.
That's my challenge to liberalism in the subtitle of this thing, that the autonomy at the communal level is an inherent, unequal playing field in terms of achievement outcomes. Meaning that the egalitarian expectation, which is the normative justification for, a lot of activism, the egalitarian expectation is misplaced because you've got these intrinsic cultural different universes of development that are side by side with each other. Can be producing, you can't expect them to produce equal outcomes. And it also means that the interpretation of history might be affected. What would equality consist of? Quote unquote equality. I mean, it is, freedom. What, some kind of metaphorical thing like that in terms of looking at the history of African Americans. Something like that, Rick. On the IQ stuff, do I have confidence that a sort of disciplined, quantitative, quote unquote, scientific inquiry into the nature of human inequality is possible? Sure, I think it's inevitable. I mean, who am I to say? I'm not a neuroscientist, but I think it's there's no stopping that.
Okay.
Thank you. By the way,
a-
on the first point, I get it, and I'm really thrilled to hear the direction you're going in. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Rick.
you. So the next one is Rick Sander.
Hi, Glenn. It's Rick from UCLA. It's good to hear you again, at least.
Thanks, Rick. I'm sorry you can't see me.
Sort of building off the last question, and your dissertation work on relational effects. There's been a lot of research in the last 20 years on the effect of Loury and housing segregation upon Black-white disparities, and it seems to me that fits very well with your argument that if you decrease the isolation of the Black community, then more of that sort of relational capital flows to them, and you see all sorts of positive effects. And it also seems that the research suggests that the way to increase housing integration is not through fighting housing discrimination, which seems to have been pretty well controlled, but by trying to increase people's imagination about where they might move and foster mobility programs, maybe somewhat race-conscious mobility programs. So I'm wondering if you have a take on that whole approach to trying to deal with racial inequality.
Not really, Rick. I'm vaguely familiar with the literature. I apologize for not being more familiar. I mean, I have a general theoretical take, which is you have these externalities within networks and so on, but that's really very abstract. On the ground, I should think that the networks and their functionality would be endogenous, that they would have to do with how those people are actually relating to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the mere fact of proximity is not anything in and of itself. In this respect, I would say that it's not just a question of whether it's the policy or what is the signal coming from on top. It's also a question of whether or not people are open to forming relationships across lines and to allowing themselves to be amenable to the beneficial effects of association. And that's endogenous also, and it can be argued for and so forth and so on. So I don't have any pat. I'm sorry not to be more helpful, but
Yeah, that's okay. I'll send you a couple of things. Some of the effects they're finding in this literature are really large, like reducing racial disparities by 50% when you lower the index of dissimilarity, the residential index of dissimilarity by 20 or 30 points. So anyway, I'll send you some follow-up and maybe engage.
Well, I would say that's encouraging.
Sure.
I mean, let's not dodge the question here. The question, this is liberalism. The question is, am I going to force somebody to live somewhere that they don't want to live in order to accomplish the social goal of benefiting the development of somebody else?
Well, to be clear, I'm not talking about any kind of quota or any kind of specific definable goal. What we find is that if you just, like in Oak Park, Illinois, if you just provide information to people about housing opportunities in neighborhoods that they wouldn't ordinarily consider because their information networks are very racially defined in the segregated area, then that just spontaneously leads to fairly dramatic declines in segregation. So you could do this through very benign sort of market-based voluntary measures that are just a little bit race conscious.
I don't want to give the wrong impression. I'm for that. At the margin, I'm for that. If there's clear evidence that segregation diminishment is associated with beneficial outcomes, especially for those who are least advantaged, and if there's a question of I have to site a highway here or a housing project there or whatever, and I can calculate the differential consequences, taking that into account and weighing that appropriately would seem to me to be entirely defensible.
Thanks.
Looks like John is next with your hand up. John Cochran. Yes, Yvonne, you're muted. Is that
John.
next?
John, yeah, sorry about that. You're next.
Can I thank you, John? You can't see me. Can I thank you for the wonderful reception of my book, man? I just love this so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. The rest of you, I wrote a review of Glenn's book on my Substack, and if you haven't read his book, you need to read his book, and not just for the more serious matters we're talking about today, but the personal growth, the personal apologia story in there is wonderful. And I would ask you to do more of that today, but we're talking about the substance of race in America, so I won't. But I will say, everybody else read the book. In the story you presented today, you did. There's part apologia, how you came to sort of conservative views, how you got tired of being every conservative's favorite black guy and wanted to, in some sense, go home, and then how you thought through again. So, your own process in changing your mind is wonderful to hear. But I'd like to hear a little bit more just about, for those of us who aren't deep in the statistics, you said Murray made some claims and some other people made some counterclaims, and you didn't like it, and then you kind of come back. But I would be curious to hear a little more about where you synthesize now the evidence on race and intelligence, IQ, different from intelligence, with a particular attention to, so Murray came here and there was a question he couldn't answer. And the question was really one of subgroup. As we know, as economists, when you start defining groups, it gets pretty arbitrary. We go white and black, but of course, black in the US is all sorts of different subgroups. Even black in the US came from one part of West Africa. As Tom Sowell keeps pointing out, what white people consider all one big black includes recent Nigerian immigrants and West Indians who are off the charts, at least on economics. If not, I don't know what it is on IQ tests. So how do you synthesize the evidence on the heritability of IQ, along with the many other things that influence IQ, and not just on this mythical black, but on subgroups within the US? Because, of course, we know IQ is heritable at the individual level. If your parents have 150 IQs, we know there's a good chance you're going to be over 100. So subgroups, which are very selected in the US, if you come from white people who settled from Scotch-Irish to Appalachia and didn't move out, I'm going to bet that there's a chance that you're fairly lower IQ there as well. So with a attentiveness to how arbitrary groups are, and this is all part of a question. So first, how do you summarize the evidence? But second, why does it matter? And really, I think the answer to much of this is, why does it matter? We know people with Down syndrome have genetically lower IQ. That doesn't make them any less citizens. That doesn't make them any less worthy individual. That doesn't give them any less legal or constitutional rights or right to live their lives as they see fit. So that by jumping to heritability of IQ, we seem to jump to the necessary conclusion is that therefore, if your group somehow defined has 2 points less IQ, you deserve less legal or constitutional rights. And that's just ridiculous. So perhaps is the centrality of the individual and their equality of the individual the answer to this mess? So I was hoping to make that a short question, but I didn't manage. I hope you find something in there useful to talk about.
Yeah, it's challenging, John. How do I assess the literature in terms of the parsing of the observed differences in cognitive ability and by racial subaggregates into genetic and environmental, cultural, and who cares? And I mean, let me take the second one first. I mean, I agree that there's no normative implication, and Charles makes this argument himself. I mean, this is one of his points. He says a value place for everybody, and then people snicker. They think he's being funny, but he's saying where you stand doesn't depend on on your IQ and so on. Presumably, you'd have to argue that there was some intervention that either was or was not passing an assessment based upon the extent to which you thought there was this was one of the extent to which you thought that there was a payoff to the investment, and the fact that it's a not easily altered trait that we're dealing with, something like that. So I'm not actually prepared to answer John on the literature, but like, I mean, I'm generally thinking that culture has a lot to say, but I think it's like I said in the remarks, it's a set of questions that people are going to be looking into, and there's no stopping them from doing that.
John Stahl.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Glenn. We've never met, but I've enjoyed your work and I really appreciate your eloquent talk. One thing that seems to be lacking or underemphasized in all of these discussions is the fact of human variability. I just finished a draft of a book pointing out that humans are not all the same, and yet a lot of our discussion proceeds on that assumption. Okay, now Herrnstein and Murray, and I should full disclosure, Richard Herrnstein was my thesis advisor. However, my thesis was on pigeons, not on IQ. One of their main points, which seems to be borne out, it's true, is that there is a substantial average IQ difference between African Americans and whites. Now, that's one point. Another point is that we're constantly emphasizing wealth and income. There are other ways to enjoy life than having a high income. And African Americans are very successful as writers, politicians, entertainers, and so on. That's not so easily quantifiable. Economists don't like it, but it's a fact. Now, if you were to take, for example, that group of whites who share the same distribution of IQ as the group of blacks, would we find that they are in any way better off than the blacks? Bearing in mind also that IQ is just one measure. It's not, quote, intelligence in any real sense. It doesn't measure social, literary, entertainment kinds of things at all. But that's just my question. Do you buy the IQ difference between blacks and whites? Never mind whether it's heritable or not, we don't really know, but almost anything is heritable, that's the fact. Do you buy that difference? And do you then think that if someone were to collect data on all the whites having the same distribution of IQ as blacks, that their situation would be different? And how different would it be?
Yes, I do buy. I mean, how am I going to not buy that to the extent that it's measurable, the cognitive ability distribution differs between racial groups in the United States? I mean, that's demonstrably so, and is reinforced on one after another assessment. So, of course, I buy that that's the case. And on the racial comparative question, I think that's an interesting question. And my inclination in the year 2024 is to bias in the direction of, I think they'd come out about the same.
Well, that's very, very interesting. And I think racial policy should bear that in mind if that's in fact true.
I mean, I want to say something, and this is in part in response to John as well. And this is the argument that Charles Murray makes. So I was against Murray before I was for him, before I was against. These people keep running around talking about there are not enough black physicists. And they're going to build policy on that. They're going to change curricula. They're going to reorganize institutions. They're going to make a whole point out of there not being enough black physicists. And physicists is just standing in here for a whole lot of stuff. How can you expect there to be a proportionate number of black physicists when the IQ distributions are as different as they are? That's a legitimate observation.
Amen.
Art.
Hi, it's fantastic to see you. We met when I was a graduate student back in 2005 at WashU, and I think I maybe know a little bit more about what I'm doing now. I am posting my review of Late Admissions in the chat. My question is kind of appropriate in light of the exchange we just had and the fact that my co-author Deirdre McCloskey just turned on her camera. I'm really interested in the example in the book where you make Coretta Scott King cry, and I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes from Thomas Sowell, where he refers to people treating certain ideas as axioms to be defended rather than hypotheses to be tested. And I wonder if you could speak to the importance of certain beliefs being sacred in this entire space if we're talking about things like racial differences.
Yeah, thanks for the question and for noticing that incident. Just to fill people in who haven't read the book, I'm at a meeting. It's in 1984. I'm a young professor at Harvard of economics and of Afro-American studies, and I'm speaking to a group of civil rights leaders, among whom is high-level leaders, among whom is Coretta Scott King, and I'm previewing an argument that's going to be featured in the New Republic at the end of that year, in which I basically say the civil rights movement is over, and it's really time, a new American dilemma. So the old dilemma was the enemy without, it was racism. The new dilemma is this developmental challenge that I was reiterating in some of my remarks here. And in this meeting, it's a relatively small meeting with these dignitaries. She's sitting, as it happens, right next to me at a conference table, and she begins to weep. And that was a moving experience for me at the time and in retrospect. And I also thought it was dramatically powerful, so I thought I'd put it in the memo. So that's what Art is referring to. Sacred beliefs. I'm not going to have a well-crafted exegesis here about the kind of anthropology or whatever it is of whatever. I'll just say there's a narrative. This is the way that I'm putting it. There's a story that's being told about the flow of history. There's an interpretation. And to hear in 1984 with Ronald Reagan ascendant that the 30-something-year-old wunderkind Black professor at Harvard is saying what I was saying may have been so jarring in the narrative expectation. And you know, I can only speculate. I can only speculate about what was going on in her mind. Sacred, you could call it that.
Jonathan?
Again, thank you very much. You'll really appreciate it. You weren't obviously at the seminar last week, but the seminar last week really made me really question Western society. So basically, as I see it, at the real basis of Western society is what I would call the Christian notion that everybody's equal in the eyes of God. And interpreting that notion, I think, has been a central problem in our society because, look, we're not all equal. And some of the inequality isn't because we're lazy. It's because by pure luck, we're born differently. And so the problem with that is that the society, you know, when we know somebody is worse off purely for the reason that they were born, that causes immense angst, I think, in society, and we react to that in various ways. And I see that as standing an impediment to trying to solve these problems, right? Because then people don't like to admit, well, wait a minute, some people were born with a low IQ and they're not doing well, not because they're lazy, but because they have a low IQ. To what extent do you think that is the cause of the impediment in us trying to really solve these problems by taking the facts as facts and taking the constraints as given and optimizing given the constraints rather than pretending they're not there?
Well, I don't know is an honest answer. I can say I take the point that there's human inequality in sort of essence and a kind of built into the social condition is the fact of difference. And I think the question is what's to be done about it? I mean, what policy, what intervention, if any, is warranted? You know, it's a question of justifying the social order, the social contract or something like that. But don't ask me to be a philosopher. That's unfair. That's asking too much.
But I do think it is the question of our time, right? We have, the military won't take anybody who in the bottom 10% of the IQ distribution. And I mean, the military, that is the one job we think they could find a job for almost anybody. What do we do with the people in the bottom 10%?
Send them to Washington.
All right.
They're already there.
Okay.
Well, we do, Jonathan, you asked we don't do, right? There's all sorts of societies, there's families, churches, institutions, local governments that don't jump to federal regulation on every issue.
And I don't think that, I really think that these are really serious problems that I think as a society, we are not approaching, partly because we don't want to recognize they exist.
I just want you to
that there isn't
think clearly about who is this we.
Well, collectively, I mean, academics, start with that.
We have 4 more questions, so let me move on with the next question by Richard Frankel.
Hello, Professor Loury. I have not read your book, but I've heard you interviewed in long form, and I think it shows, as far as I can see, a lot of examination that I wish, self-examination in a sense. And I don't think, I don't want to really talk about how to solve the problems of race in this country. I think incentives play a role, and we'll solve the problem of race when we solve the problem of the deficit. I think we know what to do, but obviously people are trying to pick up any cudgel at hand. So my question really is just in personal life, because, the people I read when I was young and admired, like Commentary Magazine and yourself, the National Review, obviously things have changed. I just have a lot of admiration, and I just wonder, Charles Murray, whether or not there's any reconciliation possible between you guys. It seems like you're the type of person who could do that, and I just wonder what would happen, or if you've tried, or what's the story with that.
Well, I can tell you that John Podhoretz and I had a drink together in Boston not long ago, and commiserated in an amiable manner about this and that. He remembered, for example, my scathing review of Dinesh D'Souza's bad book, The End of Racism, which was published in the Weekly Standard, and we had a laugh about it. I can tell you that Catherine Murray hugged me at some Sea Island soiree that the AEI had put on a few years ago, because I came to Charles's defense at my podcast, saying he gets to have an opinion about these issues, and he's not a racist. And I liked his book, Facing Reality, about crime and intelligence testing differences, which have implications for what you should expect in terms of outcomes, kind of thing like that. I mean, this kind of bold. I'm not endorsing it in every respect, but this kind of. So I get along with Charles Murray fine, all things considered. At the end of the day, reconciliation. Christopher DeMuth, who's now a kind of national conservatism advocate, he invited me to their conference in Orlando a few years ago, and I went and I gave a speech called "The Case for Black Patriotism," Black American Patriotism, in which I held forth in that vein. So we're getting along okay. So I think the report is relatively positive on the rehabilitation front.
Yeah, I think
And
if Shaq and Charles Barkley could get along after Shaq threw the ball at his head, of course, that reconciliation seemed to be affected by their mothers. Unfortunately, our mothers aren't around. That would be way to go. But it'd be nice for you guys at least to have some personal peace, because we're not going to solve this problem. I think there's too many people with an incentive to keep it going.
Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley have a shtick going on, man. These are sports commentators. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna jump to Deirdre and then Eric and then Carl. Deirdre, you're next.
Okay, I feel that I'm jumping the queue here, but if you want, how are you, Glenn? I can.
Deirdre, you're in the book. Did you know you're in the book?
No, I don't know I'm in the book. Which book is that? The FBI book of
No, it's the book we're discussing. It's my memoir. It's my autobiography, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, which was published in May by Norton. And I tell the story of a cocktail party reception at your Printers Row Loop loft apartment.
Yeah, that was
in like I don't know, 2002, 2003, something like that.
Yeah.
And my uncle comes to this party and he flirts with you. And he doesn't know your full backstory. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of a wry moment of humor.
He was a very handsome guy. I was too tempted. Here's what I want to know. Do you know about the founder effect, which is a piece of jargon from biology? It says,
I do not.
In any life form, bacteria, plants, animals, whatever, the core population center sends out occasional explorers to try out new places. And as a result, the variance of the pioneers is always smaller than that in the home place. I mean, it's kind of obvious because the pioneers are a sample. And what I think is true, and I think any human biologist would probably agree with this, the upper tail of the sub-Saharan African population is thick. It has to be, because of this founder effect. Why would there be, I mean, my own expectation is that in 100 years, all the top mathematicians and musicians in the world are going to be black. And why would there be, and why would people of African descent, on average, have a smaller IQ than these populations that all came from them? I don't understand how that would happen.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say that's useful in clarifying that, but I do take the point about this effect that you're talking about, which my colleague Odette Galore has made a big deal out of here. I see the statistical principle right away. I have a original population, and then I get sampling from it as people migrate out.
It's smaller.
There's less variance in the sample than there is in the overall population, and then we're looking at the tails for excellent on both ends, excellence and especially poor.
That's right.
And we should expect to see more of that in the original population. And since Homo sapiens have walked out of Africa, and Odette is saying the further they had to walk, the less diverse they are.
Exactly, and that that's the point. So you might get Eastern European Jews, by accident become excellent in mathematics and music. But in the long run, it's going to be black people, in my opinion.
From your lips to God's ears, dude.
Well,
Eric?
God's already heard it.
Hey, Glenn, this is Eric Wakin from the Hoover Institution Library and Archives.
Oh, Eric, I've heard of you.
Yeah, apologies for asking such an instrumentalist question amongst this scholarly group, but I know you and I and Condi have been exchanging emails about your papers. There's tremendous interest among the fellowship here, among our donors, frankly. And I even went up to Brown a couple of weeks ago to try to track you down with no luck. But I'm wondering if we could. You're a hard man to get a hold of, so sorry to hijack this. But any chance we could get on the phone again, or I'd come see you and we could see if we can get your papers here?
Yeah, I'm sorry you didn't know that I seldom go into the office these days. I'm in my very final year of retirement transition at Brown, and I work from home most of the time. And I would have been happy and remain happy to receive you, Eric, at my home address, and we could talk about that.
Okay, great. Thanks a million, Glenn.
Carl.
You know, just a quick comment. My sister just died of cancer, and I was her primary caregiver for a while. So the idea of who the bottom 10% is, I think, is elitist. We have an intellectual group here, and therefore we value intellectualism. But I've seen caregivers who can do a much more loving job than I can with my sister. Thank God they're there, regardless of their IQ. So all of us has a role to play, and I think we better be careful about saying who is on the bottom 10%. We all have different skills, and unfortunately, I think intellectualism is overvalued in our society and our economy, number one. Secondly, though, getting back to your point, Glenn, I would like to know what you think. As I think maybe you've observed, I've heard some of your podcasts. I believe that 54 of the 56 fastest 100-yard dashes have been run by Black men from Africa. And I presume that everyone believes that's heritable. But certainly you look at other professional sports, I don't believe, you tell me what your thought is. Is it because white folks have been oppressed? Is that why they're not represented the way Black folks are, particularly in something like the 100-yard dash? And if there's heritability there, why is it that there can be heritability in physical prowess, but not in intellectual prowess? So any thoughts?
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, first of all, I hear you on the point about the relative valuation of people based on the work that they do and how the market assessment is not the bottom line on that, and that has very important moral implications. I agree with that 100%. And I agree that it's implausible to imagine that the performance differences that we're looking at these extreme tail selections. I mean, we're way out, we're 5 standard deviations out or something like that, of people at the Olympics. But in any case, it's definitely there. And I don't know how much difference you need at the mean in order to get that at the tail. And but remember, I'm the guy that's saying you can't stop this train. People are going to be looking into this kind of thing and taking a moralistic stance against the hypothesis that human difference could have some intrinsic inheritable dimension, and that might be important. What, for example, about differences in violence and criminality between the racial groups? Can you rule out that there could be any? I mean, I'm not saying it is or isn't. I'm just saying I don't know how you rule that out. So maybe this is part of what Richard Swader was getting at about would you be allowed to have a narrative assessment of certain differences that draws on certain kinds of information. But anyway, I'm rambling. My basic response, Carl, is I agree that the racial differences in the NFL are not arbitrary, and there's no reason to think that the differences in the physics laboratory that I see between certain groups might not have some similar element to that. None that I can see.
Excellent. Glenn, let me ask you the final question. Sorry. So let me ask you a final question. So you wrote a paper on self-censorship and political correctness, and I wonder whether you can say something about it. It seems to me that we are sort of drowning in political correctness, particularly in academia these days, and not just political correctness, also self-censorship. And so I wanted to go back to the issue of race, and whether taboos about race. This is something that I think Art Carden touched on, but whether the issue of taboos about race or other topics can play sort of a social role. Can there be something beneficial about topics that we are not willing even to talk about because we feel embarrassed about these topics?
Well, thanks for mentioning my self-censorship work. Actually, Polity Press is going to put out a reprint of this. This was a piece in Rationality and Society, that journal that Jim Coleman used to edit way back in 1994. And I developed an argument there. I'm very proud of it. It's one of the most gratifying pieces of work I did. And it's not a technical economics thing. It's kind of a sociolinguistic thing. I mean, people like Irving Goffman influenced me, and Thomas Schelling and whatnot. But anyway, it's a signaling argument. It says, suppose I have a controversial issue and people are worried about where other people stand on it. And then they have to make public pronouncements about related matters, and listeners or observers will make an inference about where the speaker stands on the controversial value from their willingness to engage in certain kinds of explicit discourse, such as we've been engaging in here and talking about racial differences in IQ and so on. This being a subject that could get identified with having the wrong moral position on the normative question of human equality. So then people don't say what they really think about it, and you get a closure of the range of debate. And I analyze that generic phenomenon in a number of different historical contexts, as well as in a number of areas of practicality. I could go into the details, but I don't think there's time for that. On the race question, this has been an important, the unspeakable. I had a little essay in Quillette around 2021, when the world had gone crazy over the racial reckoning that was going on. And I said, there are just some things that are unspeakable. Like, you can't talk about the relevance of the family structure differences between racial groups in the population. The fact that, 2/3, 3/4 of Black kids are born and being raised in households with a single mom. And that's epical in its consequence, in my humble opinion. I read some of the sociological literature, whatever. I mean, I just think it's a first order fact. And this is the kind of thing that Murray was getting at in Facing Reality, although he didn't talk about family structure stuff. But I mean, there's just things that you can't say. That is an illustration of some of the themes that are analyzed in my self-censorship and public discourse essay, which is going to be reprinted next year by a small press. I'm going to write an afterword, and we're going to republish it.
Great. And John Cochran, I think, has the last question. Thank you, Glenn, for your answer.
I just want to close on a little more personal note. Your book is about these intellectual issues, but it also is a personal travelogue and apology, apologia of just tremendous value. St. Augustine's got nothing on you as far as how you go through the depths and then find your way back out. I think Yvonne would want to tell you found your inner Catholic, that the power of confession towards personal growth and healing. But those who haven't read it, it's just astounding. But what I wanted to ask you, the one thing you didn't say is, how did you find the ability to look in the mirror and confront who you were and what you were doing, and the ability then to be breathtakingly honest about this to yourself, to the people around you, the people you love, honest to the point of even suggesting I might still be lying a little bit. Honesty about where the remaining dishonesty is. Just remarkable transformation, starting with being able to stop telling ourselves the lies we all tell ourselves when we look in the window. Did you have any comment about how that came about and how you achieved this remarkable transformation and ability to just face the facts?
Wow, thanks a lot, John. Gosh, what can I say? The problem of self-regard, I took that seriously. I once read this wonderful book, I would say little book, except it rambles, Gödel, Escher, and Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, a long time ago, 40 years ago.
Great book.
He talks about Kurt Gödel, you know, the logical incompleteness theorem, and self-reference. Bach, the fugues, you know, Escher, the drawings. You know, he has this framework that I think is just very beautiful. What an ambitious thing. That's a great book. Self-reference. So that's where we start. And you know, I'm an economist, man. I'm a game theorist. I couldn't but avoid getting down into this hall of mirrors of you know, am I lying to myself about my own life? And what would be the point? You know, so as I went through this catalog of, you know, the various anecdotes, the you know, trials and tribulations and dramas and, you know, challenges and whatnot, I started discovering stuff about myself. And I realized what I say in the framework of the book. I'm partly the audience. This is a self-referential enterprise here. I'm the writer, I'm the subject. You should be worried. You should be holding your wallet as a reader, given that I'm in control of the narrative. But, you know, and I could go into details here. My son, Alden, whom I love, he's in his late 50s now. He's a prominent journalist in Chicago. I abandoned him as a baby. I tell this to a bunch of strangers. Hell, I've written the autobiography and it's out there. So, you know, there's nothing to be afraid of here. But I'm just using it as an illustration. What was going on in that with me? You know, and we reconciled, and we've have a wonderful relationship. And his 3 daughters, my grandchildren, God love them. The oldest has just finished law school at the University of Maryland, and so on. You know, it's a lot of stuff like that. Choking at Harvard, you know, we're all academics. I'm, you know, 33 years old, and I'm a full professor at Harvard, and I'm a hot shot. And am I ever going to write another paper? And then there's this out called, oh, you can be a pundit because you're a Black conservative. And I can make a living doing that, a respectable living at the Kennedy School instead of an honest living in the economics department. What was up with that? So there's just a lot of stuff like that. And once I got going, man, once I started discovering the freedom that came from honest assessment of my life, I just decided that there's not any point in lying to myself about it. And if I'm not gonna lie to myself, why should I lie to you?
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Glenn. This was a great talk. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions. And our next talk is October 3rd with Andrew Gelman from Columbia University. He's a statistician, and he will talk about the politicization of science and the unreplicability of science. So it's going to be a very interesting talk. Please join us on October 3rd. So again, thank you, Glenn. This was great. Really
My pleasure, Ivan. My pleasure. Thank you all.
Great job, Glenn. Thank you.